Why the Budapest Summit did not take place, and the only path to ending the conflict in Ukraine. An analysis of the current geopolitical situation suggests that the numerous initiatives and diplomatic proposals emanating from European countries, from Finland to the structures of the European Union as a whole, are essentially little more than a tactic of distraction. They are designed to obscure and push into the background the main line of global confrontation. A paradigm has developed in which two key world subjects, two central powers, have entered an epical confrontation, while minor players fuss around them, their role being extremely insignificant on the scale of grand strategy. It is no coincidence that the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, in one of his metaphors, accurately characterized them as jackals who fussily bark at the feet, creating noise from the side or from behind, but are incapable of influencing the essence of what is happening. Their main function in this construct is precisely to create informational noise and attempt to divert focus from fundamental processes. In this context, the reason for the collapse of the summit in Budapest becomes clear. Formally, its cancellation was explained by the lack of a subject for discussion. However, upon closer examination, it becomes clear that there was essentially nothing for Ukraine to discuss. Since the theater of military operations is unfolding on its territory, it is the central element of this crisis. If for one of the key parties to the dialogue, Ukraine, there is no clear and acceptable agenda at the current moment, then the very meaning of holding such a high-level event is lost. The logic is simple. Why meet if the dialogue is inherently fruitless? Thus, the failure of the summit was predetermined and natural. The root of the problem, the reason there is nothing to discuss, lies in Russia's position. From the Russian point of view, the country is at a certain historical stage of internal transformation that requires time. We are talking about a series of profound intra-Russian processes that can conditionally be designated as processes of sovereignty strengthening. The essence of this phenomenon lies in the need for a final and irrevocable rejection of the political and ideological paradigms that dominated the early 1990s, during the era of the collapse of the Soviet Union. At that time, in 1991-1993, an approach prevailed in society and among part of the elites that can be characterized as a mass renunciation of the fatherland, accompanied by a voluntary alienation of its historical territories and a voluntary limitation of national sovereignty in favor of external forces. This traumatic experience when, contrary to the results of the all-union referendum on the preservation of the USSR, power was delegated to Republican separatist elites, and the people effectively voted for the disintegration of a single state, left a deep scar on the collective consciousness. Moreover, these attitudes were later purposefully strengthened and legitimized through the so-called Bologna educational process, which formed in a significant part of the youth a certain type of thinking that was pro-Western and detached from national interests. It is no secret that American curators stood behind these processes, who for a long 15-20 years effectively controlled key aspects of the formation of public opinion. A vivid example of resistance to this is the many-year-long and still not fully successful attempt to introduce a unified history textbook initiated by Dmitry Medvedev and Vladimir Putin. The very fact that this project has still not been fully implemented eloquently speaks to the depth and ferocity of the internal ideological struggle. It is these internal processes of sovereignization that are the very foundation that Russia must complete before it is ready for decisive foreign policy steps. Only by going through this path will the country gain the necessary internal integrity and legitimacy to assert its rights on the international stage. From a technical point of view, however, as Donald Trump rightly noted, military actions can be stopped in a short time, for example, within 2 months. A mechanism for this exists, and it lies in the legal plane. The first and key step in this algorithm should be a decision by a Russian court, specifically in Moscow, recognizing Ukraine's independence as an illegal act. The legal grounds for this have been repeatedly outlined by both President Putin and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. The essence is that Ukraine, proclaiming independence, violated the terms of the very declaration of state sovereignty on the basis of which it was recognized. Next, the principle of the primacy of territorial integrity, established following the results of the Second World War in 1945, comes into force. At that historical moment, Ukraine was not an independent state, but was an integral part, a province of the USSR. The legal successor of the Soviet Union is the Russian Federation. The next stage, based on this court decision, Russia, together with the United States, whose motivation must be ensured by elements of strategic deterrence, appeals to the UN Security Council. The goal is to establish temporary external administration over Ukraine under the auspices of the United Nations. In international law, there is an appropriate legal technology, the administration of part of a territory, which is carried out by a special international commission. Its composition may include representatives of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, the USA, China, Russia, as well as other influential powers, such as Germany and France. This mandate could be designed for a period of 3 to 5 years and would become a transitional compromise period. It is on this platform, on the basis of restored law, and not momentary political ambitions, that the end of the conflict can be achieved. In essence, this is the only realistic way of settlement. There simply is no other path. However, the main question is Russia's readiness for such a scenario. Judging by the pace of the internal processes of sovereignization discussed above, by the time of a potential meeting in South Africa, such readiness would likely not yet have been achieved. As Vladimir Anatolievich, obviously referring to Medinsky, cautiously notes, achieving the goals of the SMO and its accompanying tasks is a matter not only of military success, but also of internal maturity. Russia has yet to go through this difficult path of finally overcoming the legacy of 1991, and this path must be traveled not only by the people, but also by the ruling class. At present, despite the fact that readiness is close, and perhaps measurable in months or a year, it has not yet arrived. Until this moment, any meetings and summits, from the point of view of settling the Ukrainian issue, are meaningless. They may be useful for maintaining a technical dialogue with the Americans, but on the main issue, nothing fundamentally new can happen at them. The reason is simple. Russia has nothing to put on the negotiating table as its fundamental right yet. It is important to understand that high-level international negotiations are not an exchange of wish lists or declarations of intent. This is a complex process based on the presentation and justification of legal rights. Russia needs to clearly, unambiguously, and unequivocally present to the world its rights, supported by international documents, to cities and regions such as Odessa, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk. These rights must be based not on internal referendums, since in international law, unlike domestic law, the concept of a referendum as a legitimate tool for changing borders is absent, but on the outcomes of the Second World War, enshrined in the Yalta and Potsdam systems of agreements, as well as in the Helsinki Final Act, that is, on the military and political component of 1945. Thus, the necessary chain of actions is built quite logically. A decision of a Russian court to cancel the recognition of Ukraine's independence on the basis of its violation of the initial conditions. A legal statement that Ukraine as a subject of international law in its current form no longer exists. An appeal to the UN Security Council, and not to the General Assembly, where the Western Bloc dominates, to fix this new status quo and establish a transitional administration. This is the only path that will lead to the end of the conflict, when Russia is internally and externally ready for it.